The exhortation today will be provided by Jason Winterland, and his title is Beware of the Yeast of the Pharisees. And in preparations, he would like us to read from the Gospel of Mark, starting at verse 1 of chapter 8, and we're going to read through verse 21. So again, Mark 8, starting in verse 1 and going to verse 21. In those days, the multitudes being very great, and having nothing to eat, Jesus called his disciples unto him and said unto them, I have compassion on this multitude, because they have now been with me for 3 days, and have had nothing to eat. And if we send them away fasting to their own houses, they will faint by the way, for drivers of them came from far. And his disciples answered him, From whence can a man satisfy these men with bread here in the wilderness? And he answered them, How many loaves do you have? And they said, 7. And he commanded the people to sit down on the ground, and he took the 7 loaves, and gave thanks, and broke, and gave to his disciples to set before them. And they did set it before them, before the people. And they had had a few small fishes, and he blessed and commanded them to sit them also before them. So they did eat and were filled, and they took up the broken meat that was left in 7 baskets. And they had eaten, they were about 4,000, and they sent them away. And straightforward he entered into the ship with his disciples, and came to the parts of Dalmatia. And the disciples came forth, and began to question with him, seeking of him a sign from heaven, tempting him. And he sighed deeply in his spirit, and said, Why doth this generation seek after a sign? Verily I say unto you, there shall be no sign given to it for this generation. Then he left them and entered into the ship again, departing to the other side. Now the disciples had forgotten to take bread, neither had they in the ship with them any more than 1 loaf. And he charged them, saying, Take heed, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees, and of the leaven of Herod. And they reasoned among themselves, saying, Is it because we have no bread? And when Jesus knew it, he said unto them, Why reason ye because you have no bread? Perceive you not yet, neither understand? Have your hearts been so hardened? Having eyes you see not, and having ears you hear not, and you do not remember. When we broke the 5 loaves among the 1,000, how many baskets fulls of fragments did you take up? And they said, 12. And when the 7 among them, among 4,000, how many basketfuls of fragments did you take up? And they said, 7. And he said unto them, How is it that you do not understand? So I will turn over the podium to our brother Jason Winterland for his talk, Beware of the Leaven of the Pharisees.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Brother Joe, for reading that for me this morning. And as you can tell, we're going to take our words of exhortation from the third portion of our daily Bible readings, which is Mark chapter 8. And there's a lot going on in Mark chapter 8, and we're just going to focus in really on the comment that Jesus makes. He says, Beware of the yeast of the Pharisees and the yeast of Herod, or leaven, depending on what translation you have. And just kind of think about what that meant for them and what that what some lessons would be for us today. So just looking at that expression, it starts off, he talks about yeast or leaven, and you look at the use of yeast or leaven, and it is something that is used in bread or other products to cause it to rise. You mix in the yeast and it causes it to rise, it creates a reaction, it has an impact. And this is what Jesus used to describe what they need to be aware of for the Pharisees and the things from Herod. Back when I was in college, I actually, for a while, as a part-time job, I worked at the Texas Roadhouse, and this was in Champaign, Illinois, but my job was the bread guy. And if you've ever been there, you know that they have complimentary rolls that they give to everyone who comes in. And so they bake a lot of bread throughout the day. And so I had an opportunity to make a lot of bread when I was there, and some other things. But it was kind of neat being part of that process. They made everything from scratch there at the restaurant. That was a big part of their selling point. And I'd get there in the morning, and I'd bring out a big bag of their special Texas Roadhouse flour. I'd mix in sugar and salt, warm water, and then some yeast. And then you put it in the mixer, and you let it mix for a little while. And you'd start off with a lump of dough that was about the same size as the amount of yeast, or the amount of flour that you had. And what I do is I cut it in half and put it in 2 tubs. And I put those tubs into a room on a rack, and that room was called a proofer, is what we called it. It was kind of like this metal, stranded metal, and you close it, and it had steam in there. And I'd leave it in there for a period of time, and then when I came back, that dough had really, it doubled in size, and because of the yeast that we put in there. And then I'd take it out, and I'd cut it into these little square chunks, and then I put it on a rack, and we'd let it sit for a while longer, for another, I don't know how long it was, but then it would grow even bigger, into the size of the rolls, and we put it in, we cook it. And like I said, there are other things I was doing, like, serving, putting up on the whatever you call it, the window for the servers to bring out to the people. And sometimes I get distracted, and I have a batch that I leave in the proofer too long. And you walk over there, and you'd open it up, and you'd have this this bread just sort of exploding out of there. It was kind of interesting, but that was neat. You just kind of see how yeast reacted to things. It caused it to expand. It would start off as something small. I don't understand the chemical science behind it, but it would explode into something much bigger. And so that's what Jesus talked about with his disciples this morning. He had the feeding of the 4,000, and then the Pharisees come and they ask him of a sign, and then Jesus is kind of thinking about what the Pharisees had just said to him. He's sort of upset about that. And he tells his disciples to beware of the yeast of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. So what are those things? What is Jesus talking about? And when you look through this, what you see is, at first, his disciples think he's being literal. It tells us that they have a conversation, and they reason among themselves, saying, is it because we have no bread? And so they start having this discussion about literal bread. And we don't know what that conversation looked like. Maybe they were pointing the finger at one another, saying, why didn't you bring bread? I thought that was your responsibility. Maybe they were just trying to figure out what he meant by this. But they just didn't catch on to what Jesus was trying to say. And then Jesus, in verse 17, he's almost like frustrated with them. He makes this comment, why do you reason because you have no bread? Do you not perceive? Do you not understand? Do you not see? He's just kind of really, it's like, look, we just had a miracle where I made, out of a small amount of bread and fish, this feeding of thousands of people. Why am I worried about there not being? And so what you start to get the idea is that Jesus is not being literal. They start understanding that his message is not literally talking about bread, but he's talking about something else, that this is supposed to symbolize something else that he's warning them about. And this is actually brought up in Matthew's gospel as well. When you read it in Matthew, it gives a little bit more information that kind of helps understand what Jesus is talking about. Matthew chapter 16, verses 11 and 12, and again, same setting. He says, how could you not understand that I was not speaking to you about bread? He says, but beware of the yeast of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And this time he adds in the Sadducees. It doesn't mention Herod, but anyway, same idea. It says, then they understood that he had told them to be on guard, not against the yeast and bread, but against the teaching of the Pharisees and Sadducees. So when you read the Matthew account next to this, it gives you an idea, this is what Jesus is talking about. He's comparing the yeast to teaching. So what he's saying is beware of the teaching that they're giving. It's brought up also in Luke. Luke, and this is a different incident that takes place, but it gives the same message. It's in Luke chapter 12, verse 1, and it says, in the meantime, when thousands of people had gathered together, they were trampling one another, and he began to say to his disciples, first, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees, which is hypocrisy. So it's kind of, you put these other places where he talks about it together, you get the idea. He's talking about teaching, he's talking about the hypocrisy, and this kind of gives us a little bit of an idea of some of the things that Jesus is warning against. This isn't something literal, but yeast is being used to represent something else. And again, when you look in other places in the New Testament, yeast is actually used also sort of in a similar way to symbolically teach about things. Sometimes it's in a negative connotation, and sometimes it's in a positive connotation. And just look at a couple of those passages, because I think they do help us to understand what is going on. Because what you see is, in literal sense, with a small amount of leaven or yeast, you're able to cause a relatively large amount of dough to rise. And so this term is used figuratively to represent influence. It's what seems maybe like a small influence, but it causes a big impact. And that's what Jesus is, I think, talking about here in Mark, and we see in other places. For example, if you want to look at the words of the Apostle Paul to the Galatians, and this is Galatians chapter 5, verses 7 through 10, the Apostle Paul says, "You were running well. Who hindered you from obeying the truth? This persuasion is not from him who calls you." And then Paul, again, uses the same, he says, "A little leaven leavens the whole lump. I have confidence in the Lord that you will take no other view, and the one who is troubling you will bear the penalty, whoever he is." And just context of what's going on in Galatians. Of course, Galatians, before and after this, he's dealing with the group known as the circumcision faction, the Judaizers, whatever you want to call them. But there are people who are starting to teach that you need to keep parts of the law to be saved, including being circumcised. And Paul spends a lot of time in Galatians, warning against these teachings and talking about how harmful this could be to the believers if they adopt these ideas. And that's the context. He says, this is hindering you. It's a little leaven, leavens the whole lump. And so Paul says, if you're going to let these bad teachings come into your church, it's going to have an impact. It's not just going to be a little thing. It's like a little leaven leavens the whole lump. It's going to kind of spread and create other bad ideas. 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 6, he uses this idea as well. He says, in this verse literally says, "Your boasting is not good. Do you not know that a little leaven leavens the whole lump?" Again, same idea. Little leaven leavens the whole lump. The context in there, of course, is talking about that guy who was living with his father's wife, and he was just kind of talking about, you have to deal with this thing. This is a pretty serious thing that's going on, and if you let this go on, this is going to have repercussions. And so again, that same idea that what seems like maybe a little thing can spread and become an impact in a negative way the whole lump, so to speak. And so again, you see these using these negative connotations. There is a positive one. Jesus himself uses this in one of his parables. It's in Matthew chapter 13, verse 33. And he says, he told them another parable. He said, "The kingdom of heaven is like yeast that a woman took and mixed with 3 measures of flour until all the dough had risen." So here's a way it's used positively. It's talking about, Jesus is comparing it to the kingdom. And he talks about how just a little bit of this, a lot of dough, causes the whole dough to rise. And, this parable sounds very similar to some other parables. For example, the mustard seed. What starts off as a small seed grows into something big. And it seems to be a similar message here that he's saying about the kingdom. So again, here's in a positive. But it seems like the common denominator in a lot of these passages is that, leaven is used as something that is maybe small, but it has the impact on the whole dough. It causes it all, or it causes this big reaction. And so that seems to be the common theme when it gets used in the Bible, whether it's by Jesus or his apostles, to talk about these different things. And so it seems like really, maybe one of the big takeaways is just making sure what kind of yeast or leaven is impacting it. Is it good things? Is it like in the parable about the kingdom where this woman is taking these things in and mixing in until it rises? Or is it like in these negative connotations, like where Jesus worries about the yeast of the Pharisees and Sadducees, or when the Apostle Paul warns against the circumcision faction and what they're teaching and letting in? So it seems like in some ways you kind of have to make a choice about what kind of things are you letting in. And you think about specifically, when Jesus talks about the Pharisees, what are some of the things that he's already warned against? You think about just what we know about the Pharisees in the Bible. These were a very religious group, but what the Pharisees did is they contained a mixture of God's truth and traditions. And not just traditions, but traditions that they taught as if they were God's truth. It wasn't just that they had traditions to help them serve God. They were going around as if these traditions were on the same par as the Word of God. So that's the danger of the leaven of the Pharisees, is that it spreads quickly and affects the thought process of an individual or group to the extent that it corrupts their hearts and minds to the true meaning of God's words and commandments. So for example, in Luke chapter 12, we already looked at Luke chapter 12, verse 1, but Jesus says, "Beware of the yeast of the Pharisees, which is hypocrisy." You think about what is hypocrisy. You look back at hypocrisy, comes from that idea of someone who was an actor was called a hypocrite. Just like we might call someone an actor today, they called them hypocrites at that time. But it gets used in a negative connotation, because when you say that to somebody in a religious setting, it's like you're just acting. You're not really sincere. You're just putting on this show as if you are something that you're not. And that's really a common criticism that Jesus gave to the religious leaders of his day, was this: they're being hypocrites. They were, he talks about them cleaning the outside of the cup but not the inside. He talks about them being whitewashed tombs that have, they look nice on the outside, but they're full of dead bones and things. And these are the kinds of things he's talking about. They're putting on this outward showing. So this is one of the things he warns about: is don't let that kind of teaching come into your community. In another place, this is in the last chapter of Mark, in Mark chapter 7, verses 6 through 8. He says to them, "Well did Isaiah prophesy of you hypocrites. As it is written, this people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. You leave the commandment of God on hold to the tradition of men." So again, there's the thing that he's warning them about, is that they honor me with their lips, their heart is far from me. It talks about them worshiping me, but what they're doing is they're taking man-made traditions, customs, and they're really elevating them to the point where they're being treated as if they are on the same par as the Word of God. And in fact, in one place he criticizes them because, talking about the way they were treating their parents, it's like they weren't taking care of their parents because of one of their traditions. And that's how bad it had gotten, is that their traditions have been elevated so much that they were no longer following God's law because they'd adopted these other traditions. So those are some of the things you see in his day that he was warning about. It's just taking man-made ideas and presenting them as if they're God's teaching, and again, these things about hypocrisy. So those are some of the big things about the Pharisees that we see in Scripture. In this passage in Mark, he mentions the yeast of the Pharisees and Herod. Doesn't really elaborate on what specifically about Herod that was wrong, but if you ever study Herod at all and you know anything about this guy, he was an evil guy. And he was kind of like the epitome of that guy who gets ahead by any means necessary. He was the king under, with the Romans. He was over Judea. And if you just look at this man's life, he was ruthless. He killed his own kids he thought were threats. He'd kill, you read about, when Jesus was born, they tried to kill the kids in Bethlehem. And he was very good at, making friends with the right people. But he's kind of like your epitome of that person that gets ahead by all means necessary. He doesn't think about right or wrong. It's all about, this goal of personal ambition. And so perhaps that's what Jesus is warning us about in regards to Herod, that kind of thinking where you throw out, his teachings and godliness just to do whatever you feel advances you as a person. That's how Herod was. He just completely ruthless guy. And so perhaps that is one of the themes that Jesus is warning his believers about. Don't be like Herod. It's not okay to get ahead doing the wrong things. And so anyway, those are some of the things that we see that were contemporary in Jesus' day. He was really worried about the influence of the Pharisees, influence of Herod. It's kind of interesting. We've been studying in Malachi, and there's sort of a similar theme in the prophecies of Malachi. We looked at just a little bit this morning, but you look at Malachi, the whole message of this prophecy. It's about a guy. His name is Malachi, which means messenger. But you see that as a theme throughout Malachi is this idea of a messenger. For example, Malachi chapter 3, verse 1 talks about, "I will send my messenger. He will prepare my way. The Lord you seek will suddenly come in his temple, even the messenger of his covenant." And so that idea of messenger is in there. And then chapter 2, talking about the priest, and we kind of started, well, it's actually chapter 1, verse 6 to chapter 2, verse 9, but we started that today talking about the priests, and it tells us that, maybe I'll just look at the verse, and it's starting in verse 7. So the lips of the priests should keep knowledge, and people should seek the law from his mouth. And it says, "For he is the messenger of the Lord of hosts. But you have departed from the way, and you have caused many to stumble at the law. You have corrupted the covenant of Levi." So these priests, this was their responsibility. They were supposed to be God's messengers. They were supposed to be giving a good message to the people to lead them in the kind of life that they were supposed to lead, that God called the Levites aside to be the spiritual leaders in the community. And they were failing at this. They weren't doing their responsibility. And because of it, it says they caused many people to stumble. So again, you see that same idea that what Jesus is warning about, beware of the yeast of the Pharisees, the teachings of the Pharisees. And you see that back here in Malachi. The teachings of these priests who are supposed to be leading the people are causing them to stumble. And, again, we looked at it this morning in Sunday school, but you kind of follow that, looking at Nehemiah chapter 13, and there's like a long list of issues that were going on at the priesthood. They had allowed these foreigners who hated the Israelites, they took their leaders and they had them living in God's temple. There wasn't enough room in the temple, the storerooms for the tithes and the things to support the Levites, so they had to go back to working in the fields. So anyway, these bad teachings, these bad examples by these leaders, it's kind of like that idea of leaven. It's like when they let that in, it impacts the whole loaf, it impacts the whole nation. Everything starts going bad. And so again, very similar, I think, to what Jesus is warning his disciples about in the first century. And again, I think high level, that's one of the big things in the book of Malachi. You're going to see that over and over again, God does address some of the teachings that they have, and how they, for example, in Malachi chapter 3, verse 15, it says, "You call the proud blessed, for those who do wickedness are raised up." They were teaching these people that were doing bad were actually good, and things were just backwards. And because of the teaching, or leaven as it were, it was causing some really bad things to happen in the nation as a whole. So again, I think that is the takeaway, is just watching out for what kind of influences and teachings that they were letting in. Then again, you think about our modern day application of this idea. We live in an age where there's so much information out there, right? So when, with Jesus, he kind of mentioned, beware of this influence and this influence. In their land, they had Herod and the Pharisees. For us, it's like it could be a myriad of things, because, it's out there on the internet, and just so much out there that we can get and bring in that just really isn't a healthy, sound teaching. And just like Jesus warned, this can have a bad impact. It's like yeast. It impacts the whole loaf. On the other hand, bringing in good ideas and good biblical is causing an impact in a positive sense. The apostles warned about this. The apostle Paul in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 21 is, just flip there really quick. He's kind of giving his parting words of exhortation to the Thessalonians, and he says, "Test all things and hold fast to what is good." And so that's really a good thing to keep in our minds. Anything that we hear or read about, we should be testing it. We should be asking whether it's good or whether it's bad. That should always be part of the process before you accept something. There should be that testing or proving or verification, however you want to put it. You think about in Acts, it talks about the Bereans. When the Apostle Paul came and shared the gospel with them, they had their Bibles open. They didn't just accept what he said. They were looking and making sure he was being accurate. And they weren't criticized for that. They were called noble. Even though this is Paul the Apostle, they were still making sure what he was saying, and he said that they were noble for doing that. Another place, for example, Romans chapter 12, verse 2. "Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect." And so again, there's the idea of testing things. Don't just believe everything you hear. Make sure that what you're picking up on is sound and biblical and gives a good representation as believers. So anyway, just kind of, I think, wrapping up our exhortation this morning, Jesus was really worried about his disciples. He was worried because he didn't want to see these influences from the Pharisees or Herod or Sadducees, depending on which passage you looked at, coming in like leaven and spreading in the whole lump. And so hopefully we take that warning today, maybe specifically against some of the things that we know about the Pharisees, but also broadly, anything we bring in, we want to make sure that we understand that either good or bad, what you bring in, teaching and influence-wise, it's going to have an impact. It's going to be like leaven. It's going to leaven the whole lump. And so we should prayerfully and faithfully try to make sure that we're always asking those questions, testing what is good, making sure that it's in accordance with God's will.